They produced milk with their own bodies. They held white babies to their breasts while listening to their own babies cry for that same milk. They watched their children die of starvation while their bodies betrayed them, producing nourishment for their oppressors' offspring. And the masters called this duty, called it service, called it the natural order. But the mothers knew what it really was: murder by proxy, forcing them to be accomplices in their own children's deaths. In the quiet hours before dawn in South Carolina, 1838, when the world existed in that space between darkness and light, there lived a sound that no record keeper ever documented, a sound that plantation ledgers never mentioned, a sound that medical journals of the time dismissed as irrelevant. The sound of two babies crying. One cry came from the master's nursery, a white infant in a hand-carved cradle lined with imported lace, beneath a ceiling painted with cherubs and clouds. That cry was answered within seconds. Footsteps rushed, voices cooed, milk was provided. The other cry came from the slave quarters, a black infant on a pallet of straw beneath a ceiling made of rough wooden planks that didn't quite meet. That cry could last for hours. Sometimes it would weaken. Sometimes it would stop altogether. Not because the baby was fed, because the baby no longer had the strength to cry. Between 1830 and 1860, thousands of enslaved women across the American South were forced into a practice that represented the ultimate violation of the maternal bond. They were chosen, not asked, chosen, to nurse white infants while their own babies starved within earshot. This wasn't accidental neglect. This was systematic torture disguised as economics. This was the deliberate weaponization of motherhood itself. This was slavery's most intimate cruelty. Medical records from the antebellum South show that enslaved infants had a mortality rate of 50 to 60% in their first year of life. Half of all black babies born into slavery died before their first birthday. Historians have attributed this to poor nutrition, disease, and harsh living conditions. All of those factors were real. But there was another cause that medical journals of the time barely mentioned because it was too common, too accepted, too ordinary to comment on: wet nursing. Enslaved mothers were forced to breastfeed white infants 8 to 12 times per day. Human bodies can only produce so much milk. Therefore, when that milk went to white babies, it couldn't go to black babies. The math was simple. The cruelty was calculated. The result was thousands of black infants dying while their mothers' bodies nourished white children. This is the story of Mabel, a woman who was forced to make an impossible choice every single day for 3 years. A woman who survived something that should have destroyed her. A woman whose story represents thousands of mothers whose names we'll never know, but whose pain echoes through generations. Before we tell you Mabel's story, a story that will break your heart but also show you the incredible strength of black mothers, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel tells the stories that history textbooks deleted, the stories that reveal slavery's most intimate violations, the stories that show you how people survived the unsurvivable. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And tell us, did you know about wet nursing? Did you know enslaved mothers were forced to starve their own babies to feed white babies? Let's see how many people were never taught this part of history. All right, let's begin with Mabel, because every story of systematic horror starts with one human being trying to survive one impossible day at a time. Picture the Whitmore Plantation in South Carolina, 1838. 3,000 acres of rice fields that stretched toward the coast like a green sea. The air thick with humidity, so heavy it felt like breathing through wet cloth. The smell of pluff mud from the marshes mixing with the sweet rot of rice stalks and the ever-present scent of human sweat. The main house sat on a slight elevation, the only hill for miles, painted white with columns that reached 3 stories high. Inside, rooms filled with furniture from England, crystal from France, silver from Boston. Wealth extracted from soil worked by 300 enslaved people whose hands bled into the mud every day. Behind the main house, past the kitchen garden and the smokehouse, past the overseer's cabin and the stable, stood the slave quarters. 30 wooden cabins arranged in 2 rows, each one housing anywhere from 6 to 12 people. Walls made of rough planks with gaps wide enough to see through. Roofs that leaked when it rained. Floors that were just packed dirt that turned to mud in summer storms. In the 3rd cabin on the left lived Mabel. She was 23 years old in 1838, with skin the color of Georgia clay and hands that were calloused from 14 years of field work. She had been born on this plantation, had never known freedom, had never been more than 5 miles from the spot where she now stood. But she had known love. She had married Solomon when she was 19, a quiet, strong man who worked in the blacksmith shop and who made her laugh despite everything. And in March of 1838, she had given birth to her first child, a daughter. She named her Grace, because Grace was the only thing she had to give her baby. Not freedom, not safety, not even the guarantee of keeping her. Just grace and love, and milk from her own body. For exactly 3 weeks, Mabel had been allowed to be just a mother. She nursed Grace on demand. She watched her tiny daughter's face relax into satisfaction after feeding. She memorized the weight of her in her arms, the smell of her head, the way her little fist would grip Mabel's finger while she nursed. 3 weeks of almost happiness. 3 weeks of a maternal bond forming the way nature intended. And then Mistress Catherine Whitmore gave birth to her third child, a son she named Edmund Jr. And Mistress Catherine had complications, fever, infection. Her milk didn't come in properly. Therefore, she needed a wet nurse. And therefore, Mabel's 3 weeks of motherhood ended. March 28th, 1838, early morning. Mabel is summoned to the main house. She brings Grace with her because Grace is 3 weeks old and needs to nurse every 2 hours. Mabel has no idea why she's been summoned, but she knows to come immediately when called. She walks through the back entrance into the kitchen, up the stairs, down the hallway lined with portraits of Whitmores going back 3 generations, into Mistress Catherine's bedroom where the smell of sickness hangs in the air like fog. The mistress is in bed, pale and weak. The baby, Edmund Jr., is crying in a cradle beside her. And Master Edward Whitmore is standing by the window, looking at Mabel with an expression that makes her stomach drop. "You just had a baby," he says. Not a question, a statement. "Yes, sir," Mabel says quietly, shifting Grace in her arms. "You have milk?" "Yes, sir." "Good. You'll nurse Edmund." 3 words. "You'll nurse Edmund." As if it were that simple. As if he were asking her to fetch water or clean a room. Mabel looks at Mistress Catherine, desperately hoping for intervention. But the mistress just turns her face to the wall. Mabel looks down at Grace in her arms. Grace is starting to fuss, turning her head toward Mabel's breast, searching for milk. "Sir," Mabel says, her voice barely above a whisper, "my baby needs—" "Your baby will be fed," Master Whitmore interrupts. "Someone in the quarters can give her scraps. Edmund needs a wet nurse with fresh milk. You'll move into the nursery room adjacent to this one. You'll be available whenever Edmund needs to feed." That's the end of this conversation. Therefore, Mabel's choice was taken from her. Therefore, Grace was taken from her arms by another enslaved woman who would try to feed her mashed food that a 3-week-old couldn't digest. Therefore, Mabel was handed a white baby who was not hers, who she did not love, who she was commanded to feed with milk her own daughter desperately needed. And therefore, as she sat in the nursery that first morning, as baby Edmund latched onto her breast and began to drink, as she heard Grace crying from somewhere far away in the quarters, Mabel felt something inside her break, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, completely. A piece of her soul simply cracked in half. To understand what was stolen from Mabel, you need to understand who she was before she became a wet nurse, before she became a vessel for white babies, before her body stopped belonging to her in a new and intimate way. Mabel was born in 1815 on the Whitmore Plantation, the daughter of 2 field workers named Ruth and Jacob. She was their second child. They'd had a son 2 years earlier who died of fever at age 4. Mabel survived past that dangerous threshold, growing strong despite the odds stacked against enslaved children. Her earliest memories were of the rice fields, the way water reflected sunlight like scattered diamonds, the way her back ached after hours of bending, the way mud sucked at her feet, the way rice stalks could cut your arms if you weren't careful, the way the overseer's voice carried across the water like a whip crack even before the actual whip came. She started working in the fields at age 6. That was young even for slavery, but the Whitmore plantation needed every hand during harvest season. Her mother worked beside her, teaching her how to move efficiently, how to look busy even when resting, how to survive. "Keep your head down," Ruth would whisper while they worked. "Don't never look them in the eye. Don't never talk back. Don't never give them reason to notice you. Being invisible is how you stay alive." Mabel learned. She became a ghost, present but unnoticed, working but invisible, existing but not really living. It was survival. It was all she knew. But at night, when work was done and the overseer wasn't watching, Mabel's mother taught her other things: how to recognize which plants healed and which ones didn't, how to find moments of beauty even in horror. A sunset over the rice fields, a bird's nest hidden in the marsh grass, the sound of singing from other cabins carried on the wind. "They own our bodies," Ruth told her daughter when Mabel was 12. "They own our time, they own our work, but they don't own what's inside your head. They don't own your thoughts. They don't own your soul. You remember that. No matter what they do to your body, they can't touch what's in here." She tapped Mabel's forehead. "Or here." She placed her hand over Mabel's heart. Mabel met Solomon when she was 17. He was 19, had been on the plantation for 3 years after being sold from a property in Virginia. He worked in the blacksmith shop with an elderly enslaved man named Isaiah who was teaching him the trade. They met at the Sunday gathering, one of the few times enslaved people on the plantation were allowed to socialize. Someone was playing a fiddle. Someone else was singing. And Solomon asked Mabel if she wanted to walk with him down to where the rice fields met the marsh. They walked in silence for a while because talking could be dangerous. You never knew who was listening. But eventually Solomon said, "I seen you working in the fields. You work harder than almost anybody. But you don't look beat down. You still got light in your eyes. How you do that?" Mabel thought about it for a long moment. Finally, she said, "My mama taught me that they only own what you give them. They own my body because they bought it. But everything else, that's mine to keep or give away." Solomon nodded slowly. "Your mama's wise." "She's dead," Mabel said flatly. "Fever took her last winter." "I'm sorry." "Me too." They walked further, and Solomon said, "Would you give me something that's yours?" "What?" "Your company, your conversation, your time. Not because anybody forcing you, because you want to." Mabel looked at him carefully. He had kind eyes, scarred hands from blacksmith work, a quiet strength that felt safe. "Yeah," she said, "I'd give you that." Therefore, they began a courtship that happened in stolen moments. 15 minutes on Sunday after chores. 5 minutes when Mabel came to the blacksmith shop to get tools repaired. Brief glances across the yard when work allowed. When Mabel was 19, Solomon asked if she wanted to jump the broom, a ceremony enslaved people used to marry since legal marriage wasn't allowed. Mabel said yes, not because she believed it would last, not because she believed they wouldn't be separated, but because in that moment, she wanted something that was hers to choose. They jumped the broom on a Sunday evening in June 1834. 40 enslaved people gathered as witnesses. An elderly man named Thomas, who could read and had memorized parts of the Bible, spoke words about love and commitment. Mabel and Solomon held hands and jumped over a broom together. It wasn't legal. It wouldn't protect them from being sold apart. But it was real. It was theirs. And for that one evening, they celebrated a bond they'd chosen themselves. Master Whitmore allowed it because married enslaved people were considered more stable, less likely to run, more likely to have children who would be born into slavery and increase the master's property. The master didn't know, or didn't care, that he was also creating bonds that could be used as torture later, that the love between Mabel and Solomon could be weaponized, that their future children could become leverage. But the Whitmores would learn. They always found ways to turn love into suffering. Mabel got pregnant in the fall of 1837. She was 22 years old. She knew what pregnancy meant for enslaved women. Your body was no longer just yours to work with. It was the master's investment in future property. She also knew the statistics, though she wouldn't have called them that. She knew that half of babies born to enslaved mothers didn't live to see their first birthday. She knew women who'd had 5, 6, 7 children and buried all of them. She knew pregnancy was both hope and potential heartbreak. But when she felt the first flutter of movement inside her, she couldn't help but hope. Maybe this baby would be the one who survived. Maybe this baby would know a better life somehow. Maybe this baby would be hers to keep. They allowed her to keep working the fields until she was 7 months pregnant. Then, because rice field work was too strenuous and they didn't want to lose their investment, they moved her to lighter work, helping in the kitchen, mending clothes, taking care of the chickens. Solomon built a small cradle in secret, carved from cypress wood he'd salvaged from broken wagon parts. It wasn't fancy, but it was made with love, made with hands that knew this baby, made with hope that maybe, just maybe, this child would grow up to use it. Mabel went into labor on March 7th, 1838. It was a Sunday morning, which meant she didn't have to work. Labor lasted 14 hours, long, painful, frightening hours where she wasn't sure if she or the baby would survive. An elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Sarah served as midwife. She'd delivered hundreds of babies over her 70 years. She guided Mabel through each contraction, told her when to push, when to breathe, when to bear down with everything she had. When Grace finally emerged, small, red, screaming with healthy lungs, Mabel felt something she'd never felt before. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Not joy mixed with fear, not joy tempered by reality, just joy. "She's perfect," Aunt Sarah said, placing the baby on Mabel's chest. 10 fingers, 10 toes, strong lungs, good color. She's a fighter, this one. Solomon, who'd been waiting outside the cabin, came in when he heard the baby cry. He looked at his daughter with tears streaming down his face. He touched her tiny hand with one finger. She grabbed it with surprising strength. "Grace," Mabel said. Her name is Grace. For 3 weeks, Mabel was allowed to be just a mother. The Whitmores had a policy that new mothers got 3 weeks before returning to work. Not out of kindness, but because medical knowledge of the time suggested it was better for the mother's health and therefore better for the master's investment. 3 weeks where Mabel's only job was to feed Grace, hold her, learn her sounds and rhythms. 3 weeks where Solomon would come by after his blacksmith work was done and just watch his daughter sleep. 3 weeks where they allowed themselves to believe this child might survive, might grow up, might have a life. 3 weeks of dangerous hope. And then Mistress Catherine gave birth to Edmund Jr., and those 3 weeks ended. To understand what happened to Mabel, you need to understand the economics and psychology of wet nursing in the antebellum South. Wet nursing itself wasn't invented by slavery. It had existed for thousands of years in Europe and other societies. Wealthy women had always hired poorer women to nurse their babies for various reasons. Health complications, desire to avoid the physical toll of breastfeeding, social expectations. But in the American South, between 1790 and 1865, wet nursing took on a particularly cruel dimension because the women providing milk had no choice, and their own babies had no alternatives. Here's how the math worked, according to medical knowledge of the time. A lactating woman produces, on average, 25 to 35 ounces of breast milk per day. A baby needs roughly 24 to 32 ounces per day to thrive. So theoretically, one woman could produce enough milk for one baby with a little extra. But producing milk requires the mother to consume an extra 500 calories per day and significantly more water and nutrients. Enslaved women were typically given barely enough food to sustain heavy labor, around 1,500 to 1,800 calories per day, mostly corn, pork fat, and molasses. Not enough protein, not enough vitamins, barely enough to survive, let alone to produce milk for 2 babies. Therefore, when an enslaved woman was forced to nurse a white baby 8 to 12 times per day, which was standard, her body would produce milk, but it would do so by breaking down her own tissue, by taking nutrients from her bones and muscles, by prioritizing the baby currently nursing over her own health. And because her body could only produce so much milk, there simply wasn't enough left for her own baby. Masters knew this. They weren't stupid, but they made a calculated economic decision. A white baby was worth more than a black baby in every sense that mattered to them. The white baby would grow up to be their son, their daughter, their heir. The black baby would just be more property that might not survive past age 5 anyway, given infant mortality rates. So they chose. They forced enslaved mothers to make their bodies choose. They created a system where black babies died while white babies thrived, where black mothers' milk nourished the children of their oppressors while their own children wasted away. And they called this natural. Called it how things are. Called it the proper order. But for the women living through it, it was torture. The most intimate kind of torture. Because your body betrayed you. Your breasts would ache with milk while your baby cried from hunger. Your arms would hold someone else's child while your own child weakened. Your body would respond to a white baby's cry, letting down milk, feeling the biological pull of that nursing relationship, while being unable to respond to your own baby. Some women's bodies eventually stopped producing milk altogether from the stress and malnutrition. Some women went insane from the psychological torture. Some women found ways to secretly nurse their own babies at night, though this was dangerous and not always possible. And some women, like Mabel, had to survive in that impossible space between maternal love and forced servitude, between biological response and moral horror, between the desperate need to keep their own babies alive and the absolute powerlessness to do so. This was Mabel's reality beginning March 28, 1838. This was the choice she didn't get to make. This was the torture that would define the next 3 years of her life. The nursery adjacent to Mistress Catherine's bedroom was painted pale blue with white trim. A rocking chair sat by the window. The cradle was mahogany, imported from Charleston, lined with silk. Shelves held folded linens, tiny gowns, cloth diapers. Everything was clean, organized, expensive. Mabel sat in the rocking chair holding Edmund Jr., who was 3 days old and hungry. Her breasts ached with milk, the biological response to a baby's cry that doesn't distinguish between your baby and someone else's. Edmund latched on and began to nurse. The sensation was familiar, but wrong. This wasn't Grace. This was a stranger's baby. This was the master's baby. This was the baby whose life was valued over her daughter's life. "You'll need to burp him after he eats," Mistress Catherine said from her bed, her voice weak. "And change his diaper immediately after. And don't let him sleep on his stomach. Make sure his room stays warm, but not too warm. And..." The instructions continued. Mabel barely heard them. Because through the walls, through the floor, carried on the morning air from the slave quarters a quarter mile away, she heard Grace crying. Her body responded immediately. Her other breast began to leak milk. Her arms ached to hold Grace. Her entire being wanted to go to her daughter. But she couldn't. She was trapped in this nursery with someone else's baby, while her own baby cried for her. This was day 1. It would continue for 1,095 more days. For the next 3 years, Mabel's life existed in a state of perpetual psychological torture that no one around her acknowledged as torture because it was normal, expected, just how things were. Her day began at 5 a.m. when Edmund would wake for his first feeding. She slept in the nursery, on a pallet on the floor, because Mistress Catherine wanted the wet nurse always available. Mabel would wake to Edmund's cry, not her own baby's cry, but close enough that her body would respond, milk letting down automatically, breasts aching. She'd pick up Edmund, sit in the rocking chair, and nurse him. He'd feed for 20 to 30 minutes. She'd burp him, change him, rock him back to sleep. Then she'd have maybe 90 minutes before he woke again. During those 90 minutes, if she was lucky, she could walk to the slave quarters, a quarter mile each way. She'd find Grace with whoever was watching her, rotating between elderly women too old for field work and girls too young yet. She'd hold her daughter for maybe 30 minutes if Edmund didn't wake early. She'd try to nurse Grace with whatever milk her body had left after feeding Edmund, but there was never enough. Human bodies produce milk based on demand. The more a baby nurses, the more milk is produced. Edmund nursed 8 to 10 times per day, thoroughly draining Mabel's breasts each time. Therefore, her body produced milk for Edmund's schedule, Edmund's needs, Edmund's demands. Grace got whatever was left. Often, that was almost nothing. Mabel would watch her daughter try to nurse, would feel Grace's desperate sucking, would know her breasts were nearly empty, would feel Grace pull away in frustration, would try to comfort her daughter with songs, with rocking, with love. But love doesn't fill an empty stomach. Then Edmund would cry from the main house, and Mabel would have to leave, would have to hand Grace to whoever was available, would have to walk away from her crying daughter to feed someone else's satisfied child. This happened every single day, multiple times per day, for 3 years. By the end of the first month, Mabel had lost 15 pounds. Her body was cannibalizing itself to produce milk, breaking down muscle, leaching calcium from her bones, using whatever resources it could find to keep producing the 30-plus ounces of milk Edmund demanded each day. Enslaved women were given approximately 1,800 calories per day, barely enough to sustain heavy labor. A lactating woman needs an additional 500 calories just to produce milk, plus significantly more water, protein, and nutrients. Mabel was getting the standard 1,800 calories. No extra food for being a wet nurse, no additional nutrition, just the same corn mush, pork fat, and molasses that all enslaved people received. Therefore, her body broke down. Her skin became dry and papery. Her hair, once thick and healthy, began to thin. Her teeth started to loosen from calcium deficiency. She was constantly tired, constantly hungry, constantly thirsty. But she had to produce milk, had to keep Edmund fed and healthy, had to maintain the master's property, the white baby who mattered more than her health, more than her life, more than her own baby. The Whitmores noticed her weight loss. Master Whitmore commented to the overseer that Mabel was looking poorly, and perhaps they should increase her ration slightly so she could continue producing good milk. They increased her daily food by 1 cup of buttermilk and 2 ounces of salted pork. Maybe 200 extra calories. Not nearly enough, but something. Grace received no extra food. Grace received whatever scraps elderly women could scrape together. Mashed corn, watered-down milk from the cows, which wasn't digestible for infants. Bits of softened pork fat. At 3 weeks old, Grace's digestive system couldn't process these foods. She needed breast milk. She was slowly starving. What the Whitmores didn't see, what they wouldn't have cared about if they did, was what was happening inside Mabel's mind. Human beings aren't designed to watch their babies die while actively feeding someone else's baby. The psychological conflict creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that can shatter a person's sense of reality. Every time Mabel nursed Edmund, her body released oxytocin, the bonding hormone that makes mothers feel connected to nursing babies. Her body was biochemically bonding with Edmund even as her mind screamed that he wasn't hers, that Grace needed this milk, that this was wrong. Every time she heard Grace crying in the distance, her body would respond, milk letting down, breasts aching, arms literally aching to hold her daughter. But she couldn't go to her if Edmund needed feeding. Edmund's needs came first, always, by law, by force. Mabel began to dissociate. That's the psychological term, though she wouldn't have known it. She began to separate her consciousness from her body. When she nursed Edmund, she'd stare at the wall and think about nothing. Nothing at all. She'd make her mind blank because thinking about what she was doing, thinking about Grace, would drive her insane. She started having intrusive thoughts, violent thoughts about Edmund, thoughts about dropping him, about smothering him, about making him disappear so Grace could have milk. These thoughts terrified her because she wasn't a violent person, wasn't a person who hurt babies. But the thoughts came anyway, unbidden, horrifying. She never acted on them, but their presence haunted her, made her feel like a monster, made her question whether she was still human or had become something else, something broken beyond repair. At night, when Edmund was finally asleep and she had a few hours on her pallet, she'd lie awake and cry silently. Not just sad crying, but the kind of crying that comes from the center of your soul, the kind that shakes your whole body, the kind that feels like dying, but you don't get the mercy of actually dying. Solomon would visit when he could, sneaking to the main house after his work was done. He'd hold her while she cried. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't make it stop. He could only bear witness to her suffering. "Our baby is dying," Mabel whispered one night. "I can see it. She's getting weaker. She's not growing. And I can't do nothing about it." Solomon held her tighter. "It's not your fault. It is my fault. My body, my milk. I'm choosing to feed him instead of her." "You ain't choosing nothing. They forcing you." "My body don't know the difference." And that was the deepest horror. Mabel's body didn't know she was being forced. Her body just knew there was a baby nursing, and it produced milk for that baby. Her body didn't understand that Grace was starving. It just responded to Edmund's demands, because Edmund was the baby at her breast. "I hate him," Mabel said one night. "I hate that baby. He ain't done nothing wrong. He's just a baby. But I hate him anyway. Does that make me evil?" Solomon was quiet for a long time. Finally, "It makes you human. It makes you a mother who can't feed her own child. Ain't nothing evil about that. What's evil is them that's doing this to you." Grace was 6 weeks old when Mabel first noticed she wasn't growing. Other babies gained weight rapidly in their first months. Grace wasn't. She was the same weight at 6 weeks as she'd been at 3 weeks. At 2 months old, Grace developed a rash across her body, a sign of malnutrition. Her eyes seemed too large for her face. Her cries became weaker, less insistent. She slept more, which Mabel hoped was good, but feared was bad. At 3 months old, Grace stopped meeting developmental milestones. She should have been tracking objects with her eyes, responding to voices, maybe starting to smile. She did none of these things. She just lay on her pallet, too weak to do much else. The elderly women watching her began to prepare Mabel. Aunt Sarah, the midwife who delivered Grace, pulled Mabel aside one evening. Baby, she said gently, you need to know. Grace ain't thriving, her body using everything just to stay alive. Ain't nothing left for growing. She just need more milk, Mabel said desperately. If I could just nurse her more. You doing everything you can. This ain't on you. This on them. Aunt Sarah gestured toward the main house. They the ones killing her, slowly, using your body to do it. But you ain't the one killing her. Mabel knew Aunt Sarah was trying to help, but it didn't help, because regardless of who was to blame, the result was the same. Grace was dying. At 4 months old, Grace developed pneumonia. Her tiny body didn't have the strength to fight it. For 3 days, she burned with fever, while Mabel could only visit between Edmund's feedings. Mabel would hold her daughter's hot little body, would whisper prayers and promises, would beg her to hold on. But Grace didn't hold on. On July 15th, 1838, 4 months and 8 days after she was born, Grace died in the night. She died in the slave quarters, in the arms of an elderly woman who wasn't her mother, because her mother was in the main house nursing a white baby who wasn't sick, who was thriving, who was alive while Grace was dying. Mabel didn't even know Grace had died until morning. She'd fed Edmund at 5 a.m., had cleaned him and put him down for his morning nap, had walked to the quarters to check on Grace like she did every morning, and found Aunt Sarah sitting outside the cabin, tears streaming down her face. Baby, Aunt Sarah started. But Mabel already knew. She'd known for weeks this was coming. She just hadn't wanted to believe it. Mabel walked into the cabin, saw Grace's tiny body on the pallet, already cold, already stiff, saw her daughter gone. And something inside Mabel didn't just break this time. It died. Just died. Like Grace. Like the part of her that was still capable of feeling. After Grace died, Mabel stopped crying, stopped feeling. Became something mechanical. A body that produced milk, that held babies, that performed tasks, but had nothing human left inside. The Whitmores didn't give her time to grieve. Grace was buried the next day in the slave cemetery. No marker, no ceremony, just a small grave among hundreds of other small graves. Mabel was allowed to attend the burial, but only for an hour because Edmund needed his afternoon feeding. Master Whitmore told Mabel, I'm sorry for your loss, but Edmund still needs nursing. You understand? Mabel understood. She understood that her grief didn't matter, that Grace's death didn't matter, that the only thing that mattered was keeping Edmund fed and healthy. So she returned to the nursery, picked up Edmund when he cried, nursed him, changed him, rocked him, all while feeling absolutely nothing. This numbness was a survival mechanism. Psychologists now call it emotional detachment or dissociative disorder. It's what happens when pain becomes too great to process, when the mind protects itself by simply turning off feeling altogether. Mabel existed in this state for months. She functioned, she performed her duties. But she wasn't really there. The woman Mabel had been, the woman who loved Solomon, who had hoped for Grace, who believed in something better. That woman died when Grace died. What remained was just a body that produced milk. What Mabel didn't know immediately was that she wasn't alone. There were 7 other wet nurses on the Whitmore plantation, 7 other enslaved mothers who'd been forced into the same impossible situation, 7 other women who'd watched their own babies die or struggle while feeding white babies. They didn't talk about it openly. You couldn't. Speaking about grief, about loss, about rage toward white babies could get you killed. But in quiet moments, in stolen glances, in the way they'd nod at each other when their paths crossed, they communicated, I know. I see you. You're not alone in this. It was Patience who first reached out to Mabel directly. Patience was 34 years old, had been a wet nurse 3 times over the past 12 years. She'd borne 6 children total. 3 had died before their first birthday, all 3 while she was nursing white babies. The other 3 had survived somehow, through luck or through Patience's desperate nighttime feedings when the white baby slept. 2 weeks after Grace died, Patience found Mabel sitting outside the nursery during one of Edmund's naps. She sat beside her without saying anything for several minutes. Then quietly, You thinking about ending it? Mabel looked at her startled. What? Your life. You got that look. I've seen it before. On Sarah 3 years back. She was wet nursing the master's daughter. Her own baby died. Week later, Sarah walked into the rice fields during high water and didn't come back. They said she drowned by accident. Weren't no accident. Mabel was quiet. She had thought about it. had thought about walking into the fields or eating oleander, or just stopping eating, stopping drinking, stopping existing until her body gave up. I ain't judging, Patience continued. God knows I thought about it myself, more than once. But I'm going to tell you what kept me alive, in case it helps. What? Anger. Patience's voice was flat but fierce. Anger that if I die, they win. They get to keep living like what they'd done to us was fine, like we was just property that broke. But if I stay alive, if I survive this, then I can remember. I can make sure what they done don't get forgotten. I can tell my children that survived. I can make sure their sisters and brothers who died ain't erased from the world. Mabel listened, felt something stir beneath the numbness. Not much, but something. Every day I wake up, Patience said, I choose to survive. Not for them, for me, for my babies that died, for the ones that lived. I survive because surviving is the only revenge I got. Therefore, Patience taught Mabel the first rule of survival. Your survival is resistance. Every day you don't die is a small victory against the people trying to break you. But Patience also taught her other things. Practical things. Dangerous things. The Whitmores, like most slaveholders, believed that white babies needed feeding every 2-3 hours during the day but could sleep longer stretches at night. Therefore, Edmund's nighttime feedings were typically around 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., leaving a 6-hour gap. Patience taught Mabel, that 6-hour gap, that's yours. That's when you can nurse your own babies, if they're still alive. This only worked if your baby was still alive, and if you had the physical strength to sneak out. Mabel's situation was tragic because Grace had died before Mabel learned this was possible. But Patience's 3 surviving children had been kept alive through these midnight feedings. I'd nurse the master's baby at 10, Patience explained. Soon as she was asleep, I'd slip out, run to the quarters, nurse my own baby for maybe 20 minutes, then run back before the master's baby woke at 4. Did that for 2 years with my last one. You never got caught? Almost. Twice. First time I told them I'd gone to check on my baby because I heard her coughing. They beat me for leaving without permission, but they believed the lie. Second time, I said I was using the privy. They suspicious. But what they gonna do? Say I can't use the privy? Other wet nurses had different strategies. Clara would pump her breasts during the day, expressing milk manually and hiding it in a jar, then having someone sneak it to her baby. It wasn't ideal. The milk would spoil without refrigeration. But some milk was better than none. Ruth had convinced the mistress that her rheumatism was worse at night, and she needed her daughter, who was 12, to help her walk to the privy. Her daughter would then take that opportunity to nurse Ruth's infant son, while Ruth stood guard.
Hannah had persuaded her master that her own baby crying in the quarters was disturbing her sleep, which made her less able to nurse the white baby effectively. They'd allowed her to bring her baby to the main house to sleep near the nursery. She could nurse both babies, though the white baby always ate first and ate more. These were small resistances, tiny rebellions against an impossible system. They didn't solve the problem. Black babies were still starving, still dying at horrific rates, but they were something. They were attempts to keep their own children alive despite everything. Beyond the practical strategies, the wet nurses taught each other how to survive psychologically, how to keep your mind from shattering completely. Dissociation was common, learning to separate your consciousness from your body while nursing white babies. Patience taught Mabel, when I'm nursing the master's baby, I ain't there. I'm somewhere else in my mind. I'm with my mama who died when I was young, or I'm imagining my children grown up and free, or I'm just empty, anything but being present for what's actually happening. Compartmentalization was another strategy. Dinah, a wet nurse who was 26 and had lost 2 babies while nursing white children, explained, I got different parts of myself. There's the part that nurses the master's baby. That ain't really me. That's just a body doing a job. Then there's the part that's a mama to my living children. That's the real me. I keep them separate in my mind. If I let them touch, if I think about my babies while I'm nursing his baby, I'll lose my mind. Some women created elaborate fantasy worlds. Sarah, who'd lost all 3 of her children to starvation while wet nursing, would tell herself stories while she rocked white babies. Stories where she was free, where her babies had lived, where she was nursing her own children in her own house. The stories weren't real, but they kept her sane. Some turned to religion. Rachel would pray constantly, not out loud, but in her mind. She'd recite Bible verses while nursing. She'd promise God that if he got her through this, what? There wasn't really anything she could promise. She couldn't change anything. But the prayers gave her something to do with her mind besides scream. Some turned to rage, kept it buried deep where no one could see but used it as fuel. Patience was this type. "I hate them," she told Mabel once. "I hate that baby I'm nursing even though he ain't done nothing wrong. I hate his mama. I hate his daddy. I hate every white person on this plantation. And that hate, that's what keeps me alive. Because one day, somehow, I'm going to survive long enough to see them pay. Maybe not in this life, but in the next one, God going to make them answer for what they done. And I need to be alive to witness it." In the spring of 1839, 1 year after Grace's death, Mabel discovered she was pregnant again. She was 24 years old, had lost 2 children, and was still nursing Edmund, now 15 months old, and her first thought when she realized she'd missed her monthly bleeding was no, not again. She told Solomon. He was conflicted, happy because he wanted children, devastated because he knew what pregnancy meant while she was still a wet nurse. "Maybe this time will be different," he said, trying to be hopeful. "Maybe Edmund will be weaned by the time the baby comes. Maybe nothing," Mabel interrupted. "You know how this gonna end. Same as Grace. I can't keep 2 babies alive. Can't even keep 1 alive. Why you think this time gonna be different?" Solomon had no answer. Mabel thought about ending the pregnancy. She knew plants that could cause miscarriage. Aunt Sarah had taught her. But she also knew those plants could kill her. And part of her, a tiny part that had survived Grace's death, wanted this baby, wanted to try again, wanted to believe that maybe, somehow, this child could survive. She was 4 months pregnant when Mistress Catherine weaned Edmund. He was 20 months old, older than most enslaved children got to nurse from their own mothers, but white babies were allowed longer nursing periods. For 4 months, her body was her own. Her milk dried up. Her breast stopped aching. She could eat without her body immediately converting food to milk. She could rest. She could prepare for this new baby with a desperate hope that this time she wouldn't be forced to be a wet nurse. But then Mistress Catherine got pregnant again, and Mabel knew. Before her own baby was even born, she knew that she'd be called to the main house again, that her milk would belong to someone else's baby again, that this child she was carrying might die just like Grace. Mabel gave birth to a son in September 1839. She named him Samuel after her father. He was healthy, strong lungs, good weight. Solomon cried when he held him. For 3 weeks, Mabel nursed Samuel exclusively. 3 weeks where she allowed herself to bond with him, to learn his cries, to memorize his face. 3 weeks, just like with Grace. And then Mistress Catherine gave birth to a daughter, and Master Whitmore came to Mabel's cabin and said the words she'd been dreading. "You'll nurse the baby. Report to the main house tomorrow morning." Solomon tried to argue. "Sir, please, we just lost our daughter. Please don't—" The overseer's whip came down across Solomon's back before he finished the sentence. He fell to his knees. "You don't speak unless you've been spoken to. Mabel will nurse my daughter. That's final. If you object again, you'll be sold downriver and you won't see either of them again." Therefore, Mabel had a choice. Watch Solomon be sold away or return to the main house. It wasn't really a choice. The next morning, she carried 3-week-old Samuel to the main house. She was assigned to nurse Mistress Catherine's daughter Helen, and the cycle began again. Nursing Helen while Samuel starved was worse than the first time with Grace because Mabel knew exactly what was coming. There was no hope, no belief that maybe this time would be different. She knew her son was going to die and there was nothing she could do about it. This time she tried the midnight feedings.
She'd nurse Helen at 10 p.m., then run to the quarters and nurse Samuel for 20 minutes before running back. It helped. Samuel got some milk, got some time with her mother, but it wasn't enough. She tried pumping during the day, expressing milk and having it sneaked to Samuel. But her breasts never felt empty when she did this, and Helen would cry if she wasn't completely satisfied, and the Whitmores would complain that their baby wasn't getting enough milk. So Mabel had to stop pumping because Helen's needs came first. She tried eating more, hoping her body would produce more milk, but she was already getting barely enough calories. Eating more would mean stealing food, which was punishable by whipping or worse. Samuel lived longer than Grace. He made it to 7 months. Mabel had hoped desperately that maybe this one would survive. 7 months was longer than most enslaved infants lived when their mothers were wet nurses. But then winter came. Samuel developed a cough. His tiny body, weakened from months of inadequate nutrition, couldn't fight the infection. He died in February 1840, 7 months and 2 weeks old. This time, when Mabel heard the news, she didn't cry, didn't react, just nodded when Aunt Sarah told her, walked to the grave the next day and stared at the small mound of dirt. Solomon tried to comfort her. She pushed him away. "Don't," she said, "just don't." "Mabel, I can't do this again. I can't feel this again. I can't." So Mabel went deeper into numbness, deeper into dissociation, deeper into the mental space where she didn't exist as a person with feelings, just as a body that performed functions. She nursed Helen, changed her, rocked her, did everything required. But Mabel's soul had left her body. What remained was just an empty vessel going through the motions. If you're still watching this story, you understand now why it was called the ultimate violation. This wasn't just physical slavery, it was psychological torture. It was the weaponization of maternal love itself. It was forcing women to choose between their own babies and their oppressors' babies, except it wasn't really a choice because the outcome was predetermined. Hit that subscribe button because we're not done with Mabel's story, and drop a comment. How did these women survive this? What kind of strength does it take to endure this and not completely lose yourself? Let's continue, because somehow, against all odds, some women found ways to survive, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, and we need to understand how. In 1841, Mabel got pregnant again. She was 26 years old, had lost 2 children, and was still nursing Helen, now 2 years old. And when she realized she was pregnant, she felt nothing. No hope, no fear, nothing. Solomon was terrified. "Maybe we shouldn't have this baby," he whispered one night. "Maybe you should, he meant abort, end the pregnancy, stop the cycle of loss. Mabel considered it, seriously considered it, but something stopped her. Not hope, but stubbornness, a refusal to let them take this from her too. They'd taken her freedom, her labor, her children, her milk, but they couldn't stop her from trying to bring life into the world, even if that life was doomed. "I'm having this baby," she said flatly. "What happens after, we'll see." This time, something different happened.
Mistress Catherine weaned Helen when Mabel was 6 months pregnant. She wanted Helen on solid foods before the new baby came. Therefore, Mabel had 3 months where her body was her own. 3 months to rest, to eat, to prepare. And then Mabel gave birth to another daughter in December 1841. She named her Ruth, after her own mother. And for the first time in Mabel's experience, through luck, through timing, through circumstances she didn't understand, no one called her to be a wet nurse. Mistress Catherine didn't get pregnant again. The other white women on the plantation who'd recently given birth already had wet nurses. Therefore, Mabel was allowed to nurse Ruth. Just Ruth. Her own baby. For the first time in 4 years, Mabel's milk belonged to her daughter. She didn't trust it at first, kept waiting for someone to come take Ruth away, kept waiting for the summons to the main house. But weeks passed. Months passed. Ruth grew strong and healthy. She gained weight. She met milestones. She smiled. She laughed. And slowly, so slowly, Mabel barely noticed it happening, she began to feel again. Not happiness. Not yet. But something. A small crack in the numbness. A tiny piece of herself returning. Ruth survived. She lived past 1 year, past 2 years, Past 5 years. She grew up strong and healthy. But Mabel never fully recovered from what had been done to her. For the rest of her life, Mabel struggled with what we now call complex PTSD, survivor's guilt, and attachment disorders. She loved Ruth. Of course, she loved her daughter. But she also held herself at a distance, terrified that if she loved too much, Ruth would be taken too. She had nightmares for decades, dreams where she was nursing white babies while Grace and Samuel died in the background. Dreams where her breasts wouldn't produce milk no matter how hard she tried. Dreams where all 3 of her children were crying and she couldn't reach any of them. She developed what we now recognize as depression. There were days she couldn't get out of bed, days where she stared at nothing, feeling nothing. Solomon would have to physically move her, feed her, keep her alive. She also developed an intense protective rage toward Ruth that manifested in controlling behavior. She didn't want Ruth out of her sight, didn't want anyone else touching her, would panic if Ruth cried. This wasn't healthy maternal love. It was trauma expressing itself through hypervigilance. Aunt Sarah, who'd seen dozens of wet nurses over her lifetime, recognized the signs. "Baby," she told Mabel once, "you gotta let that girl breathe. You're holding on so tight you're gonna smother her. They took Grace. They took Samuel. They ain't taking Ruth." Nobody trying to take Ruth. But you gotta understand, you can't control everything. You survived something that should have broken you. But you can't let that trauma poison your love for the child that lived. Mabel intellectually understood this, but emotionally, she couldn't let go of the fear. The trauma had rewired her brain in ways that couldn't be easily undone. Of the 8 wet nurses on the Whitmore plantation during the time Mabel served, Patience survived. Of her 6 children, 3 had died while she was wet nursing, and 3 had survived through her desperate midnight feedings. She lived to age 52 and died during the Civil War when the plantation was burned by Union troops. Her surviving children all lived to adulthood. Clara lost all 4 of her children to starvation while wet nursing. She eventually stopped getting pregnant. Her body seemed to shut down reproductively after the 4th loss. She went completely mute at age 34 and never spoke another word for the remaining 26 years of her life. Ruth had 5 children, lost 3 while wet nursing. She survived slavery and lived to see emancipation. Her descendants say she never smiled again after her 3rd child died, not once in 40 years. Hannah lost 2 children while wet nursing, but managed to save 3 through a combination of midnight feedings and smuggled cow's milk, which often made the babies sick but kept them alive. She developed severe depression and attempted suicide twice, survived slavery, died at age 43 of what doctors called general decline, likely untreated depression and PTSD. Dinah lost all 3 of her children while wet nursing. Killed the 3rd white baby she was nursing by dropping her down the stairs at 6 months old. Claimed it was an accident, was sold downriver for being careless. Died in the fields in Louisiana at age 31. Sarah had 7 children, lost 6 while wet nursing. Her 7th survived because she got pregnant at age 42, when she was considered too old to be a wet nurse anymore. The child was the only one who lived. Sarah survived to see emancipation and died at age 67. Her descendants say she kept every piece of clothing her dead children had worn and would sit with them, talking to the clothes as if the children were still there. Rachel lost 2 children while wet nursing, went insane after the 2nd death, would walk through the quarters at night screaming, was sold to an asylum plantation in Alabama where she died at age 28. No one knows what happened to her body. Therefore, of the 8 wet nurses, all of them lost at least some of their children. Only 3 of the 8 remained, fully mentally stable, if you can call surviving slavery stable. The practice of forcing enslaved mothers to wet nurse white babies destroyed countless lives, shattered countless minds, and created intergenerational trauma that continues to echo today. As Ruth grew older, she began to understand that her mother was different from other mothers. More protective, more anxious, more prone to staring into space. Ruth would ask questions. "Mama, why are you always so worried? Mama, why you don't like me playing with other children?" And Mabel couldn't explain. When Ruth was 12 years old, Aunt Sarah, now in her 90s and near death, called Ruth to her bedside and told her the truth. Told her about Grace and Samuel. Told her about the wet nursing. Told her why her mother was the way she was. Ruth came to Mabel crying. "Aunt Sarah told me about my brother and sister, about what they made you do." Mabel, who hadn't spoken about Grace and Samuel in years, felt something break open inside her. She pulled Ruth close and cried for the first time in over a decade. Cried for the babies she'd lost, cried for the years of numbness, cried for the trauma she'd passed to her surviving daughter without meaning to. "I'm sorry," Mabel said. "I'm sorry I ain't been a better mama to you. I'm sorry I've been so broken. I couldn't lose you too. Couldn't stand it." Ruth held her mother. "You ain't broken, Mama. You surviving. That's different." Therefore, Ruth became her mother's keeper in ways, helping Mabel through bad days, understanding when Mabel needed space, forgiving her mother's limitations. This wasn't fair to Ruth, who deserved a childhood without that burden. But it was reality. The trauma didn't stay contained in Mabel's generation. It leaked into Ruth's life, affected how Ruth approached her own motherhood later, created patterns that would echo through generations. In 1865, when Mabel was 50 years old, the 13th Amendment ended slavery. Mabel had survived 35 years of bondage, had survived losing 2 children to the wet nurse system, had survived psychological torture that should have killed her. When freedom came, Mabel and Solomon and Ruth, now 24 years old and married with 2 children of her own, walked off the Whitmore Plantation. They settled on a small plot of land 20 miles away, bought with money Solomon had saved from hiring his time out. But freedom didn't heal the trauma. Mabel still had nightmares, still dissociated, still struggled with depression, still hypervigilant about her grandchildren in ways that worried Ruth. One day, Ruth's youngest daughter, named Grace, after the sister she'd never met, was crying because she was hungry, and Ruth was delayed getting home from working in the fields. Mabel, watching Grace, became increasingly agitated. The baby's cries triggered something deep in her memory. Suddenly, Mabel was back in 1838, listening to her own Grace crying while she nursed Edmund. She had a complete breakdown, screaming, crying, unable to distinguish past from present. Ruth came home to find her mother curled in a corner, rocking back and forth, whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," over and over. This happened several more times over the years. The trauma was always there, just below the surface, ready to erupt when triggered. Mabel died in 1883 at age 68. According to Ruth, her last words were, "I see them, Grace and Samuel. They're waiting for me. Finally going to be able to hold them again." Ruth lived until 1921, dying at age 79. She had 7 children, raised them all in freedom. But she carried her mother's trauma with her. She was obsessive about feeding her children, would panic if they missed a meal, would wake in the night to check that they were breathing. Ruth's children passed these patterns down to their children. The anxiety, the hypervigilance, the complicated relationship with food and feeding and maternal duty. The trauma didn't die with Mabel. It lived on, transmitted through generations in ways no one understood at the time. In 2018, a psychologist named Dr. Patricia Hall published a groundbreaking study titled Intergenerational Trauma: The Psychological Impact of Slavery Era. Wet Nursing on African American Women. Dr. Hall interviewed 200 black women descended from enslaved people and found striking patterns. Higher rates of anxiety around breastfeeding, complicated feelings about feeding their children, hypervigilance about their children's nutrition, intense guilt about working while their children were young. Many of these women didn't know their ancestors had been wet nurses. But the trauma patterns persisted across 5, 6, 7 generations. Trauma literally changes brain chemistry, Dr. Hall explained in an interview. When enslaved women experienced the horror of watching their babies starve while feeding white babies, that trauma affected their stress hormones, their neural pathways, their entire biological system. And emerging research suggests that some of these changes can be passed down through epigenetics, actual changes to gene expression that can affect descendants. In other words, the wet nursing system didn't just traumatize the women who experienced it directly. It created biological and psychological changes that affected their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and beyond. The trauma Mabel experienced in 1838 didn't end when she died in 1883. It continued through Ruth, through Ruth's 7 children, through their children, and on and on. Today, Mabel's descendants likely number in the hundreds. Most don't know Mabel's story. But they carry pieces of her trauma whether they know it or not. Some mysteries remain about the wet nursing system in slavery. How many women were forced to be wet nurses? We don't know. Records are incomplete. Estimates range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands across the entire slavery period. How many black babies died as a direct result of wet nursing? We don't know. Infant mortality records didn't distinguish between causes, but given that enslaved infant mortality was 50 to 60%, and that wet nursing directly reduced milk available to those infants, the number was certainly significant. Did any women successfully resist becoming wet nurses? Some tried, some were whipped, some were sold. Some found ways to make themselves unsuitable, deliberately gaining or losing weight, claiming health problems, occasionally sabotaging their milk production. But resistance was dangerous and often unsuccessful. What happened to the white babies who were nursed by enslaved women? Most never knew, never understood that their childhood nourishment came at the cost of black babies' lives, never knew the woman they called Mammy had her own children die while feeding them. Some learned later and felt guilt. Most never thought about it at all. Mabel's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. What does it mean to survive something that should destroy you? Mabel lived. She didn't die when Grace died, or when Samuel died, or during the years of psychological torture. She survived. But was that life? Was that living? Or was it just existing, a body continuing to breathe while the person inside was already dead? Can trauma this severe ever be healed? Mabel never healed. She learned to function, learned to survive, but the wounds never closed. Is that failure? Or is surviving with wounds still a victory? What do descendants owe to ancestors who suffered unimaginable trauma? Mabel's descendants today, if they could be found and told her story, what would they owe her memory? Should they carry her pain forward, or should they release it? How do you honor trauma without being consumed by it? Was the love between wet nurses and the white babies they raised real? Some enslaved wet nurses genuinely loved the white children they nursed. That love was biochemically reinforced through oxytocin released during nursing. But that love was also compelled, forced, extracted through violence. Can coerced love still be real love? Or is it something else entirely? A biological response hijacked by evil system. Picture a hospital in Atlanta, 2024. A young black woman named Grace Freeman has just given birth to her first child, a daughter. The baby is healthy, crying, perfect. The lactation consultant helps Grace position the baby to nurse. The baby latches on. Grace feels the milk let down, feels her daughter nursing, feels the connection forming. And suddenly, unexpectedly, Grace starts crying. Not happy tears, grief tears, deep, wrenching sobs that she doesn't understand. What's wrong? The nurse asks, concerned. Grace doesn't know how to explain it, doesn't know why she's suddenly overwhelmed with grief in what should be a happy moment. Doesn't know that her great grandmother was a woman named Mabel who nursed white babies while her own babies died. Doesn't know that trauma can echo across generations. But her body knows. Her body remembers what her mind never learned. That's the legacy of slavery's wet nurse system. It doesn't just live in history books. It lives in bodies, in genes, in the ways black mothers relate to feeding their babies, in anxiety that seems to come from nowhere, in grief that has no name. Mabel died in 1883. But Mabel's pain didn't die with her. It's still here, still carried by descendants who don't even know her name. And until we acknowledge that pain, until we understand how deep the wounds of slavery go, until we recognize that trauma doesn't disappear just because time passes, we can't fully heal. They forced enslaved mothers to feed white babies while their own babies starved. They called it duty, called it service, called it the natural order of things. But it was torture, the most intimate kind of torture. The weaponization of maternal love itself, the ultimate violation of the bond between mother and child. Thousands of women experience this. Most of their names are lost to history. But their pain isn't lost. It's carried forward by their descendants. It's written in the bodies of black women who feel anxiety about breastfeeding and don't know why. It's present in the hypervigilance of black mothers who can't explain why they're so worried about their babies eating enough. Mabel's story is one story among thousands. But it matters, because it shows us that slavery wasn't just about labor or economics. It was about destroying the most fundamental human bonds. It was about making mothers choose between babies when no mother should ever have to make that choice. It was about using women's bodies against them in the cruelest possible way. And it's about the fact that some women survived it anyway. Not undamaged, not whole, but survived. That survival is its own form of resistance. That survival is worth remembering. That survival means Mabel's great-great-great-great-granddaughter Grace is alive today, nursing her baby in freedom, carrying forward a line that slavery tried to extinguish. The system tried to break them. It succeeded in breaking many. But it didn't break all of them. Some survived, some persisted, some carried their pain forward and transformed it into strength for future generations. That's Mabel's legacy. Not just pain, not just trauma, but survival. Against all odds. Against everything designed to destroy her, she survived. And her daughter survived. And her daughter's daughter survived, all the way down to today. That's the victory slavery couldn't take away. If this story broke your heart, if it showed you something about slavery you never knew, if it made you understand trauma in a new way, hit that subscribe button. Because these are the stories that need to be told. The stories that are uncomfortable. The stories that make us confront how deep the wounds of slavery really go. Drop a comment and tell us, did you know about the wet nurse system in slavery? How do you think Mabel found the strength to survive? What do we owe to ancestors who experienced trauma like this? How do we heal generational trauma that goes back this far? And share this video with someone who needs to understand that slavery wasn't just about working in fields. It was about systematic destruction of families, of maternal bonds, of the most fundamental human relationships. It was about making mothers accomplices in their own babies' deaths. For Mabel, for Grace and Samuel, for patients Clara, Ruth, Hannah, Dinah, Sarah, Rachel, for all the mothers whose babies died while they fed someone else's babies, for all the descendants still carrying that pain without knowing where it comes from. Their names may be forgotten, but their survival matters. Their pain matters. Their legacy matters. Subscribe. Remember, honor their survival. And understand that healing generational trauma starts with acknowledging how deep the wounds really go.